Okay, Adam, when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Wanted to be a writer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool, always knowing what you want to do with your life, I assume.
Yeah, I think it was always pretty clear to me. I was always making up stories, making people take dictation for me before I could write. And I have writers in my family, so nobody seemed to think it was that strange. It wasn't until I got to graduate school that I was surrounded by people who were having, phone calls every day with their parents, like, why don't you go to law school? What is this bullshit you're going to do?
And who were the writers in your family? Parents?
My grandmother was a poet, and I grew up around her, and my grandfather was a judge, but he seemed always to be writing. He was always writing decisions. He was a law professor first, and he was known, I think, as a pretty great legal writer. So both of them, and then my father is a journalist. He works at the Boston Globe. My mother, when they met, was a reporter. Her brother is a sports writer. So pretty much that entire side of my family, plus my father.
Huh. What are your grandparents' names?
Ben Kaplan and Felicia Lamport.
And your father and mother?
Charles Mansbach, Nancy Mansbach.
Huh. And where are you in the birth order?
First of two.
Okay. And how did people relate to your early ambition to be a writer? Mainly encouragement, I assume?
Yeah. Well, my earliest, I think, serious trajectory as a writer was poetry and lyrics. I was pretty serious about hip hop. I was an MC. So probably the first thing my parents really saw me doing circa, junior high or maybe a little earlier was writing a lot of rhymes and performing them or recording them. So, they were a little bit perplexed by that because hip hop was not something they were too familiar with. Nobody really was outside of people who were really committed to it in 1987. But I think that they appreciated that I was doing something artistic, and I think they also saw that what I was doing, that hip hop was something that was very political at the time, and they were able to make those connections. And my father, being a journalist, had a collection of 60s paperbacks on his shelf, so I would be listening to Public Enemy, and they'd mention, Bobby Seale or Eldridge Cleaver, and those were actually books that were in my house. So I was able to sort of make those connections, and my parents sort of saw it happening. They understood that hip-hop was about politics and also poetry. And, my grandmother's poetry was actually in some ways very similar, very, I always fail to say this word correctly. What am I trying to say? Analogous? Is that the word?
Yeah, analogous, or analogous, yeah.
Right. Her shit was really satirical and pointed and political, and it rhymed, and her wordplay was fantastic. And she had this weekly column that was syndicated in a number of newspapers called the Muse of the Week in Review. She would basically take classical forms and sort of rewrite them, remix them about current events. She had a famous piece called The Love Song of R. Milhouse Nixon, where she took Eliot and turned it on its head, do I dare them to impeach, that kind of thing. So in a funny way, my grandmother's writing was very similar to hip-hop in the sense that it was rhythmic, it was rhyming, it was political. So I think my family in many ways was able to see what I was doing without freaking out too much.
And whereabouts did you grow up?
Grew up in Newton, Massachusetts.
And is that an overwhelmingly wide area? I don't know it. So.
It's like a close suburb to Boston, so it's accessible to Boston by public transportation. It's it's pretty white. I think it's probably about 40% Jewish, but it's not. It's certainly not exclusively white. I think the schools that I went to were sort of fairly diverse public schools that were part of the busing program, the METCO program, which was sort of Boston's unilateral form of school integration. Boston's a really pretty segregated and racist city, and it took them about 20 years after Brown versus the Board of Education to truly segregate their schools, and the way they did it was by busing black kids from, the inner city from Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan out to suburban schools. So there were some black kids living in Newton, and there were a bunch more going to my schools through this program. So in some ways, the schools were more diverse than the community.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a black accent?
You mean like Barack Obama or Colin Powell?
I don't know how to say it. I'm sure there are right and wrong ways to say it. Has anyone ever, like, there's an, I guess the polite term is urban, but has anyone ever said that to you? I'm just maybe totally out of left field.
No, I mean, every time I do any kind of public event to a mostly white or Jewish audience, somebody asks me some kind of question about the way I speak, and I always try to get them to, you know, think a little bit critically about what it might mean to sound black or sound Jewish or sound urban or anything, because I think that you know, we tend to think monolithically about these things, and you know, like anybody else, I guess the way I speak is sort of the sum of, you know, various experiences and travels and that kind of thing. And so people always want to ask me that, and sometimes they don't know how to say it. Sometimes they talk around it. Sometimes they come right out and say, you sound black. And, you know, I always sort of, my impulse is to fuck with people when they ask me that, because I don't know what sounding black exactly means. Like, how, you know, who sounds quintessentially black? Is it Jay-Z? Is it Bill Cosby? You know? So it's not a question I have a particularly good answer for, except to wonder what it really means, you know?
Well, it's interesting. Barack Obama sometimes speaks differently to a black audience and to a white audience, meaning the intonations and the accent that he uses will change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very true. I think probably that's the case with all of us, that we have sort of infinite variations in the way we present ourselves and the way we speak. You know, I certainly, the funny thing is that I probably try to sound as, you know, like I've been doing these Jewish book fairs in the last couple months, and I'm certainly trying to come off, I'd really like to avoid that question, because I'd rather talk about, like, other shit at these festivals, so I try to come off, like, I try to be as sort of straightforward and you know, I try to sound as vocally uninteresting and undifferent as possible, and I still get this question. So maybe there are limits to the amount of, you know, control I have over this. I don't know.
Right. At what age did you, I'll just say it in the vernacular, fall in love with blacks, or did you, or what happened there?
I don't fall in love with blacks. I don't think that ever happened. I think that, you know, I got into hip-hop when I was about 11 or 12. I think largely because it was articulating sort of realities that I wasn't seeing personally, but that I sort of knew were out there. It was something that was talking about subjects that were taboo, such as racism, police brutality, the inequality in the school systems. You know, these were things that I'd sort of already seen a little bit, but that nobody I knew was talking honestly about. So I was sort of moved by the honesty and the world expanding nature of the music. And I think that led me to explore other black cultural forms. When I was about 14, I became friends with Delphio Marsalis, trombone player, Wynton and Branford's younger brother. He was friends with a teacher at my school who was a mentor of mine. He would come to school or come to town, and I would, you know, hang out with him for the week, and he would put me on all kinds of jazz, which led me, I think, to writers like Ellison and Baraka and Baldwin. And, you know, I don't think per se that I ever, you know, fell in love with black people. I think that I found inspiration in the art produced under such duress, art that was being made by people who were profoundly marginalized, whose humanity was called into question, and who, in some cases, responded with works of astounding beauty